Father, let me have the share of the estate that will come to me. So the father divided the property between them. A few days later, the younger son got together everything he had and left for a distant country, where he squandered his money on a life of debauchery. When he had spent it all, that country experienced a severe famine, and now he began to feel the pinch. So he hired himself out to one of the local inhabitants who put him on his farm to feed the pigs. And he would willingly have filled himself with the husks the pigs were eating, but no one would let him have them. Then he came to his senses and said, "How many of my father's hired men have all the food they want, and more? And here am I dying of hunger. I will leave this place and go to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired men.' So he left the place and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with pity. He ran to the boy, clasped him in his arms, and kissed him. Then his son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the calf we have been fattening and kill it. We will celebrate by having a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." Verse 25, "Now the eldest son was out in the fields, and on his way back, as he drew near the house, he could hear music and dancing. Calling one of the servants, he asked what it was all about. The servant told him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the calf we have been fattening, because he has got him back safe and sound.' He was angry then and refused to go in. And his father came out and began to urge him to come in. But he retorted to his father, 'All these years I've slaved for you, and never once disobeyed any orders of yours. Yet you never offered me so much as a kid for me to celebrate with my friends. But for this son of yours, when he comes back after swallowing up your property, he and his loose women, you kill the calf we have been fattening.' The father said, 'My son, you are with me always, and all I have is yours. But it was only right we should celebrate and rejoice, because your brother here was dead and has come to life. He was lost and is found.'" This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. So I've entitled the devotion this morning, Homecoming, Celebrating Family Reunion. And this morning, when I woke up, I thought I was inspired to just write a couple of Chinese characters. Yeah. So this is, anyone recognize this Chinese character? Jia, correct. This is home, right? In Chinese, a very important word. You can see this hanging, all framed up in Chinese families, homes, or maybe even some Chinese restaurants, right? Because it just emphasizes that this is a very precious word in Chinese culture, jia, and home, as you're familiar with the Snoopy, right? The cartoon. I remember one strip that says, "Home is where the heart is," right? So that's very heartwarming. And, it's a very universal thing to really cherish the home, the family. And this past Sunday, Saturday actually, Saturday and Sunday, but specifically Saturday, what happened is that, I think it was Sunday, 8th of January, the borders of China opened, right? And I was watching the news, it went on, and they were kind of filming what happened at all the immigration points between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, the closest place, and even down the Pearl Delta. And you find that lots of people were streaming back into mainland China to a great warm welcome at the immigration point. because these were students, these were workers who have never been home for the last 3 years since the pandemic began. They were caught out in January 2020. So it was a joyous occasion, tears rolled down cheeks and all that, because it was heartwarming family reunion. So Jia is very important, and the Chinese has this concept that whenever the moon is round, it is time for the family to come together, reunion, right? That's why the Chinese has a saying, 家园花好人团圆, 月圆人团圆. It's okay if I just share some of these Chinese phrases. Never too early to learn Chinese, Joseph Needham, one of the Cambridge professors, went to China at the age of 40, and he learned not only the Chinese language, but he invested the next 40 years in understanding Chinese, not only history and stories, but science. And he came up with a compendium of the Science and Civilization in China encyclopedia. Yeah? So never too early to start. And then I also wrote this morning 4 words. I don't know whether you can read this. Okay, 家和人安. Okay, 家和人安, what does that mean? It means that when the family has harmony, everyone is safe, will have peace, right? So that's also an aspiration, that family will have experience of harmony, and that everybody will be safe and sound and peaceful, right? And there's also a related saying that says 家和万事兴, which means that when family is reunited, reunion, and harmonious, then everything will prosper. How do you like that? Right? So that's something that I think is the best way for every parent, to aspire to in the Chinese family for a Chinese New Year or for a New Year. Right? How do we celebrate New Year? We say Happy New Year. What does that mean? Actually, Happy New Year means the family is together. Right? It's a bit like the American Thanksgiving, right? Everyone gets together and you're thankful. That is the concept, yeah. And so I think it's the father's ambition and aspiration to always see the family safe, secure, and successful. And there's always this dream that tomorrow will be better. 明天会更好. There's a better tomorrow. That's always a simple dream. So the Chinese, and I think it's like Asian and actually quite universal, everyone wants to have a better tomorrow and have the family together. But sometimes the worst fears can come true, right? When family breaks up into dispute and disharmony, and there's some troublemaker, and actually that's what the Chinese government is most fearful of. There's one word I want to introduce to you. I didn't have time to write it out, but it's called luan. Luan means disorder, right? So the Chinese country of China, there's only afraid of one word, luan. When there's disorder, when there's disharmony, when there's problems, everything can go haywire, right? So this morning, we see this story here in the parable of the prodigal son, where this apparently prosperous family experienced this kind of disruption when the younger son decided to ask the father, give me my share of the inheritance, which is like, hey, I want to cut the ties, I want to go on my own way, which he did. And the father given to him, and this prodigal son drifted off to see the world, right? There's so much of the world to see. There are always push and pull factors, right? Why somebody who is younger wants to leave the home and get out to see the world. So this young son, left for a distant country, and I would suspect it could be a city, right? I'm into city mission, and I like to encourage that all of us consider cities or urban mission as the harvest field of the 21st century, right? Because everyone is coming out from the mountains and villages. I always joke with my friends in the churches when I preach in Singapore that if in urban Singapore is thinking of mission of sending people only to the mountains and villages, then you are doing Mao Zedong mission, because Mao Zedong in the 60s and 70s, what did they do? 上山下乡, send them to the mountains and to the villages, into the third line. But today, God is at work in the cities, and there are a lot of people like the prodigal sons who are flocking to the city off to see the world. pursuing the urban dream. And in the world today, there is a rising middle class, right? We are entering what has been called at the beginning of the 21st century, the age of prosperity, right? Because the Asian middle class is rising, and they all aspire to the American dream. They all aspire to the Singapore dream, And by 2013, Xi Jinping gave in and said, oh, there's also the China dream, right? So what we have is a lot of people pursuing dreams of a better life, of owning condominiums, of cars and country club memberships and what have you, But guess what? From the sustainability point of view, it's not sustainable, right? Experts tell us it's going to take at least 4 planets to be able to sustain and provide for the dream of the rising Asian middle class. So it's not tenable. So what happened in this case with the prodigal son? His dream turned into nightmare, when dreams dashed, plans bombed, and all your wishes, don't come true, And sometimes when you are out there in a new place and you don't understand the law, you can run foul of the law and get into trouble and end up in jail. Or sometimes you can have accidents and end up in a hospital. It happens. Or sometimes you can fall into bad company and then have all your wealth cheated away, or squandered, and then you end up with all this crisis, or what Kelly yesterday reminded us, dissonance, right? So in life, sometimes we know that there's a sense of orientation. You have a direction in life, and then there's a disruption, and then you have a disorientation. And then hopefully you can find a reorientation where you can begin to not only recover, but also to discover. I hope that when we go through crisis, we don't just hope to recover and go back the same old, right? But hopefully it's same but different. That we discover something new about ourselves, we discover something new about our destiny, right? So this is perhaps seen in this prodigal son because he ended up in the piggery. How do you like the word piggery? I learned this word from my friends in Manila because then I discovered you can have piggery in a modern urban homes. At the back of your home, you can have a piggery, and there's no smell. It's amazing. They make money out of that business. Yeah. So reflection in the piggery. This prodigal son experienced the time in pain, in isolation, perhaps. All he had were company of pigs. But there he had time alone to begin to lick his wounds, and perhaps also to discover, and find out that, well, maybe this is not going the way it should be. I need to have a new direction and make new decisions, right? So perhaps that's important for when we go through crisis, instead of just limiting the damages, but perhaps to ask God to give us a new course, not just course correction and then go back to your same course, but when you meet storms in life, you set sail and then you meet storms in life, don't just try to circumvent it. Maybe it's time to find a new direction, and maybe then you discover America, like Christopher Columbus. Yeah. So I think this is important when we meet crises that could be turning points in our life. And when we think about the plight of the prodigal son, actually, he is a young man in the diaspora, isn't it? He had left hometown and gone into the diaspora. So this is a story of a young man in the diaspora whose urban dream has turned into an urban nightmare, and he ended up joining millions of urban poor. The United Nations Habitat tells us today there are over 830 million urban poor in the world. 2015, the UN said we have achieved our Millennium Development Goals target. And so they set out for a SDG, Sustainability Development Goal, from 2016 to 2030, because they said urbanization has addressed a lot of issues, in uplifting poverty and all that. But guess what? He has created a new set of problems, because poverty in the rural areas are different from urban poverty. You can be living above $2 US dollars a day, which is that kind of benchmark for poverty, you can maybe even make $5 a day, but you cannot survive in the city, right? So that's urban poverty. So we don't have time to go into the reason why the prodigal son ended up the way he did. Maybe he was a spoiled brat, maybe he had a bad character, he was spoiled by his father, and he just went his own willful way, disobedient. Or maybe he was just a simple chap with a very naive notion of life, and then he fell into bad company. Or maybe he's a good guy, but poor life skills, and wanted quick gains and was poorly advised and ended up, lost his way and nearly lost his life. Yeah. So many of the young people who leave for the cities in a distant country can fall into traps and temptations, and end up, in a very bad shape. So this morning I just want to take a bit of time to just spotlight and riding on what Setzer and various ones have mentioned yesterday about reaching young people, especially in the city. I used to work for the YMCA, and the YMCA was a vision set out in 1844 by George Williams to reach young people. This was the height of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of people were coming to the cities, Liverpool, Manchester, and all that, to find employment. And you have Oliver Twist, or even child labor as well. So it was a vision to reach out to the young people in body, mind, and spirit, holistic care for them. And that's how the whole Sunday school concept came about also, to provide real education for people who would otherwise have no education. Yeah? And my hero was John R. Mott, because he brought the vision of YMCA to Asia. Right? And this was important because YMCA then grew in Asia, in all the key countries and major cities of the world 100 years ago. So fantastic. And I want to spotlight in particular international students because I think a lot of international students need to be cared for in the cities that they have gone to pursue higher education or to pursue education or a different life with their family. And I just share with you stories of how Christians or the church can touch some of these international students. I remember when I was a young pastor, I served 7 years as a pastor. So one of the things I did was, I tried to be there in the evening, just hanging out, watching the sunset. So I'm a kind of idealist person now, dreamer, right? Watch the sunset. And then what happened is that in this neighborhood, there'll be people coming back from work and all that. And then I noticed there was this Chinese young man, always in a suit and tie in Singapore, which is very hot weather. I don't wear this in Singapore, But I discovered, so he's a handsome-looking, 6 foot tall young Chinese man. And then eventually, so I always smile, and then eventually we began to talk. And then one day, as he was passing by, he asked me, "Pastor, do you have a piano in the church?" I said, "Of course." "Can I play the piano?" He said, "Sure." I said, "Come in and play." And as we were playing, then he told me that, he has been here as an intern. He was from Paris, right? So he's a second generation Chinese. His parents fled from China in 1949 when the communists took over. And then he grew up and was born in Paris. And he was totally socialized as a Frenchman, But he said, "I played the piano, but over the last 3 months, I was sent here as an intern in the bank, of France, and I miss playing the piano. So I said, you can come and play the piano every day." So we did, and cut a long story short, we formed a friendship, and that led to discussions about Chinese culture, my passion, and he was eager to find his identity, We talk about identity, of a Chinese man growing up in France, and what is Chineseness, yeah? So, and many years later, after he went back, I was happy because I encouraged him to go and visit China and explore. And he sent me a postcard. He said, "I'm on a train, passing by Sichuan, and I'm writing this postcard to you to remember our conversations." So his dream has come true in that sense. And years later, I got an invitation to his wedding in Paris. By that time, I wasn't able to take time to go. But it was just an example, and more importantly is, I led him to Christ. So he said, God has his own mysterious way to lead him all the way from Catholic France to come to Singapore to understand the Protestant faith and to become a Christian, right? So I think that's a little thing that we can do. Start with a smile and a bit of hospitality. You can't play the piano. And then another story I want to share is my disciple in church. He was a bright young man, commando. So in Singapore, young men have to serve the army, and he was a commando officer. And he was, holding the state flag at the National Day parade, And then this was in August. And September, he went to Australia to study in the University of Queensland. And the following spring, during that break in February, he and his few friends drove all the way in a minivan from Queensland from Brisbane all the way down to Melbourne. And there he was so tired at about 5 a.m. or something. He was driving and was half asleep, and he hit something. There was a road accident, and thank God all his other companions were not seriously injured. But as a driver, he was pinned down at the wheel, and when they extricated him, they discovered he was paralyzed from the neck downwards. So it was a tragedy, But to cut a long story short, his family, of course, spent the next 1 year there with him in hospital. And I want to say that the beautiful thing is that the church reached out to him, right? And the school and the church reached out to him. And his family, his parents who were not Christians, came to Christ through this accident. Yeah, so it's excuse me. So it's a great testimony of how love of a Christian community reaching out to an international student can transform a family, right? Even in misfortune. And I say this. Also, I want to share about the Singapore Nursing Christian Fellowship. They have a great strategy. These nurses from the head nursing officer who are Christian, and a bunch of them, about 50 of them. So they decided 20 years ago, when Singapore was reaching out to train China students to become nurses in Singapore, and then give them 3 years of nursing training and tie them down with 6 years of contract, so that we can staff our hospitals, right? So what they did was they made use of this policy, and they said, we are going to welcome them, these students, 18-year-olds, at the airport, and hold their hand, welcome them, orientate them, care for them, house them, and journey with them so that they can finish their nursing education and finish their contract, and take them to church and all that kind of thing. So 9 years later, they will be there at the airport to send them back to China. And many of them have become Christians, right? Isn't that a great strategy? Right? Reach out, and it's not just occasional. It's very intentional. It's very immersive, right? So, and I won't have time to share of my own other experience, but we started an International Students Club, and reached out to China students in particular. And there are hundreds and thousands of all these students here. When they come to the best schools, government schools, they're all very well taken care of. A lot of them are the scholars. But those who come to the private schools, they are not so good in their academic, but nonetheless, when they come here, they're very good, in all their science and maths, but they keep failing English, right? So after 2 years, they are still failing English, so their parents are very upset and discouraged. And they ask, why are you not able to pass your English language? You're in Singapore. Okay, the reason is because they live in student hostels where everyone is a Chinese student. And they go to a school where everyone is a Chinese student. You think they will practice English, right? So what we did was we began to hold English language lessons. And here's a tip for you. Don't give them free. Charge them, right? Because they can pay. And they did. They paid and they appreciated, But in the meantime, I brought them home for Chinese festival, dumpling festival. And they said, oh, we've never eaten dumplings in Singapore like this. We take them home for mooncake festival. Oh, your mooncake is different from ours in China. Invite them for Christmas, and so on and so forth. And I tell you, they really appreciate it because they said, before this, I've never been to a Singaporean home. See? So this is a good way to really engage them, befriend them, and serve them, because many of them fight with their principals in school and fight with the landlords, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think this is the story of the prodigal son, but from the the scripture, we know that he finally repented and returned home and was able to enjoy a family reunion. But the question is, can we provide a home away from home in the city rather than to wait for them to be totally messed up, discouraged, and then finally decide to return home, right? And then they will have a very bad impression and experience of that city. But if we in the city can provide them with a home away from home, isn't that great? Then we can experience what the father experienced. You see, the father and the elder brother had a different heart, just like the prodigal son. The prodigal son's heart was restless, a wandering heart. But it's like T.S. Eliot says, right? We never cease from exploring. But the end of our exploring is to arrive back where we began and to know the place for the first time. So he experienced that. But the wandering heart that came back home. But the elder brother's heart was always on money and material wealth. That's why he cannot see the picture. To him, is a transactional. I work for the father. I slave for the father. The father is my boss. He's supposed to reward me, but he didn't. That's why I get upset. But the father's heart is one that celebrates life, that celebrates family, that celebrates reunion, that celebrates resurrection. Because he kept saying, the son was dead, now is come back to life, was lost, but is now found. Right? So I pray that all of us, God will give us the father's heart that will begin to celebrate not only reunion, but resurrection, to see lives being saved, being restored, and as we say in CNET, that we will join the Father in this daily anticipation, waiting for 1 billion people who are sitting and waiting for enlightenment. That they too can come as they go on a quest and a journey to seek enlightenment, the meaning of life, that we can begin not only to wait for them, but like the Father, when we see them, to reach out, run to them, engage them, embrace them, and minister to them, affirm them in anticipation of that great eschatological celebration, that eschatological family reunion whose host will be the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. God bless you. Thank you.